All right, hello everyone. My name's Dr. Rose Crowley and I'm here with my colleague Dr. Jeremy William. Today we'll be discussing the Capla Long Term Trial. So I think we all know Capla was a randomized control trial in patients with persistent atrial fibrillation comparing pulmonary vein isolation alone to PVI plus posterior wall isolation. And now Dr. William will tell us about the longer term follow-up and outcomes of that study.
Thanks so much, Rose. So, as everyone knows, the posterior wall has long been thought of as a potential target for patients with persistent atrial fibrillation. And up until Capla, a lot of the non-randomized data was supportive of its role in preventing arrhythmic recurrences. And unfortunately, the 12-month outcomes of the Capla study published in JAMA in 2023 didn't show an improvement in either arrhythmic recurrence nor AF burden, comparing pulmonary vein isolation alone to pulmonary vein isolation plus posterior wall isolation. And I guess there are a couple of questions that we wanted to address with the long-term outcomes paper. The first was that we know that patients with persistent AF, if you follow them up for more than 12 months, they're more likely to have late recurrences compared to patients with paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. And so we thought that maybe a signal might emerge that posterior wall isolation may be advantageous beyond 12 months. And I guess the second question was, in patients that have redo procedures, what do we find at the time of a redo procedure? What was the durability of the vein isolation and the posterior wall isolation? And along that line, what's multi-procedure success? In these patients that have come back, is there a signal towards benefit? So we wanted to answer all those questions with a long-term outcome paper. So Capla Long Term was a prospective continuation of the Capla study. Capla initially enrolled 338 patients with persistent atrial fibrillation and randomized them one-to-one to a strategy of PVI alone versus PVI plus posterior wall isolation. And as part of the long-term project, we prospectively followed up these patients for a median of 3.6 years. And that follow-up involved routine rhythm surveillance, either with an alive core transtelephonic ECG monitor, implanted device continuous monitoring, or with longer term Holter monitors up to 28-day continuous Holter monitoring. And I guess the key finding of our paper was that at that median of 3.6 years, unfortunately there still was no benefit accrued from the patients who underwent that initial PVI plus posterior wall isolation. The Kaplan-Meier curves were pretty superimposed out to 3.5 years post-ablation.
Right, and what did you find in terms of how many patients did end up undergoing a redo procedure? What were the findings at redo?
So about 100 out of the 338 patients in the Capla study ended up having a redo procedure, and the vast majority of those were endocardial redo procedures, which gave us the opportunity to assess a bit of an electrophysiology study in terms of what was reconnected and what wasn't. So while the durability of pulmonary vein isolation was about 50%, the durability of the posterior wall isolation was only about 25%. That is to say that 75% of the patients that came back for a redo procedure had posterior wall reconnection. We don't know what the proportion of patients overall who experienced posterior wall reconnection was. We only know in this subset of patients that have declared themselves as having a high arrhythmic, having an arrhythmic recurrence by coming for a redo procedure. But it does point to an intrinsic weakness of RF when it comes to the posterior wall. We've known for a long time that it's challenging to achieve durable isolation of the posterior wall. There's the challenge of the esophagus right next door, and collateral heating can prevent the delivery of transmural lesions. And we also know that there's thicker tissues and epicardial connections that can force you to isolate within the box. And certainly we think that both of those were significant challenges in delivering durable isolation of the posterior wall. And perhaps the message of Capla is that if we are going to do posterior wall isolation, RF is not the ideal modality to do so.
So then the big question is obviously, do you think PFA is going to potentially provide us some better durability on the back wall? And if we can get sort of reliably durable posterior wall isolation, is there a potential that we may see a benefit in these patients?
Yeah, so really interesting questions, and certainly that's what I think the research is heading. PFA, pulse field ablation, is perfectly poised to target the issues that RF is so weak with. In terms of heating of the esophagus, PFA is a non-thermal ablation modality, and in terms of delivering transmurality and targeting epicardial connections within the box, PFA offers the opportunity to be transmural and target essentially the entire posterior wall. The only experience we have so far is a retrospective review of patients who underwent posterior wall isolation with PFA at the time of index AF ablation. That was published in JACC EP earlier this year, and unfortunately that didn't show an improvement. So far the jury's out, but I think that's where the research is heading.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I believe Capla Long Term has now been published.
That's right. So it was published in the September edition of the European Heart Journal, and I invite everyone watching this video to check it out.
All right. Thank you very much for your time, Jeremy.
Thanks, Rose.